Our first speaker today is Rich Trouton and Leveling Up, Managing Admin Rights in the Enterprise. Hello, Rich. How are you?
I'm doing okay.
Thank you for coming today. Please go ahead and share your slides.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Looks like they're live. You're good to go.
Okay. Thank you all for joining me today to discuss how to level up and manage admin rights in the enterprise. Before we get started, there's two things I'd like to mention. The first is that all the slides, speakers, notes, and the demos are available for download, and I'll be providing a link at the end of the talk. I tend to be one of those folks who can't keep up with the speaker and take notes at the same time. So for those folks in the same situation, there is no need to take notes. Everything I'm covering is going to be available for download. Second, of course, is to please hold all questions until the end. If you have questions, make a note and then ask me afterwards in the Q&A. And with luck, I'll be able to answer most of your questions during the talk itself. So thank you for joining me today to discuss admin rights and managing them in enterprise environments. And as part of approaching this, let's first look at Apple's existing platforms and how the concept of admin rights applies to each. So Apple currently has 4 platforms, 5 if you count iPadOS as being a separate platform from iOS. So we have iOS, iPadOS, macOS, tvOS, and watchOS. So most of these platforms do not have the concept of multiple users. There's just one user state in play by default. So iOS and iPadOS do include authentication, but there's still usually only one user context, which is in scope. Now, iPadOS does have the concept of multiple user accounts by supporting user sessions for multiple managed Apple IDs, but that's a special configuration option for when sharing an iPad between multiple people is necessary. All the managed Apple ID user accounts are equal in terms of what they can do on the iPad, so the idea of standard user versus admin user doesn't come into play. Instead, the user paradigm is equal user rights with separation of documents and data for each user. So when we're discussing the paradigm of multiple user accounts and those user accounts having different permissions for access and actions, we're really only talking about one Apple platform, and that's Macs running macOS. But the Macs haven't always had it though. If you look at the various versions of the original macOS through System 1's introduction in macOS 9, you see a similar user paradigm to what you see on Apple's other platforms. So by default, there was only one user context and the operating system would boot into it automatically. So if the paradigm we use today didn't come from the original macOS, where did it come from? Well, it comes from Next Computers, and more specifically, the Unix-based Next Step operating system developed by Next. And of course, Apple bought Next in 1996. By 1998, Apple is using Next Step's foundations to build what would eventually become macOS 10. And this included building a Unix-based operating system, which included multiple user accounts. And more importantly for our discussion today, Next Step included the paradigm of an account named root, which is a super user account. So on Next Step, root can do anything. It has read-write access to the entire local file system, and it can run any command. So Apple had previously built Unix-based operating systems with super user accounts for specialized purposes, but now Apple is mainstreaming this paradigm for its main operating system of both multiple user accounts and a super user account that has both more access and privileges than other user accounts. However, there's only one root user in Unix and only one password to that account, and sharing passwords is a security issue. Apple's solution was to introduce a new set of super user privileges for macOS 10, which they designated an admin account, and these privileges could then be applied to multiple accounts. So management of which accounts have admin rights is handled by membership in a group called admin. However, membership in this group only handles admin rights for the macOS 10 graphical user interface. To provide administrative rights on the command line, Apple uses the sudo command line tool. So this tool enables authorized user accounts to run commands as root or as another user. Now, as part of the OS installation process, Apple installs a configuration file for sudo, which grants members of the admin group all the privileges that the sudo tool can grant. Now, in turn, this means that members of the admin group have the same ability as the root account to run all commands and functions with the root account's privileges. So with regards to the actual root user, Apple put some controls in place to limit the root user account on macOS 10. These controls include disabling the root account by default, discouraging its use, and providing ways to access elevated or root privileges using other means, like using the sudo tool. So this same model has been used in all versions of the operating system since macOS 10.0 Cheetah through Monterey, including using that admin user account, that administrators group, and also by using sudo. So now there are non-root user accounts which have more privileges than other user accounts. So what's the difference in privileges between admin and standard? Well, admin user accounts can add or manage user accounts, can install applications, and they can change their account settings and also system settings. Standard users can change settings which affect their own account and also install software. I can see some folks looking at the last item in the standard user list and saying, wait, standard users can't install software. They need admin for that, right? Well, that's not necessarily so. After all, you can take your local user account, put an applications folder inside of your local home folder, and drag a self-contained application like Firefox into that applications folder within your local user folder. And if you double click on that, it'll launch. And may have to answer some questions about it now, but it'll run. It'll run just fine. And that is software installation. And it's also possible to install software as a standard user using the App Store. Now, this does not mean that all installation is allowed. Installing applications via an installer package will request authentication from a user account with admin privileges. And without that, installation is going to fail. Now, from a user experience perspective, that request for authentication is the main delineation between what standard user accounts can do and what admin user accounts can do. A standard user's authentication won't be accepted, but an admin user's authentication will be accepted and the desired action performed. And that same user experience also applies to changes settings. When changing settings which only apply to the logged in user, no authentication is requested. When changing settings which apply to the system as a whole, authentication by an admin user is required. So now we know the backstory and the different kinds of user accounts on Apple's Mac operating system. Why does it matter whether someone has admin rights or not? This is why it matters. Anything the root account can do, an admin account can also do. Giving admin rights to a user account on the current version of macOS means that they now have all the powers that root has. As discussed earlier, on most Unix-based operating systems, the root account can do absolutely anything. It has read-write access to the entire local file system, and it can run any command. So from a security perspective, this seems like an easy case. Unless you're willing to trust your users with the ability to do absolutely anything on their Macs, you shouldn't give them admin rights, right? Well, let's take a deeper look at that. How well does that statement apply to the current version of macOS? So Apple has implemented a number of security features, which among other things, limit the power of root and admin users. The most recent change is the moving of macOS's system software to a read-only isolated boot volume as of macOS Catalina. This boot volume is cryptographically sealed as of macOS Big Sur, and if the seal is tampered with, macOS won't boot and it must be reinstalled. To limit what the super user can do and add another layer to macOS's security model, Apple has developed System Integrity Protection, or SIP. SIP is designed to limit the power of root and to protect the system even from its own super user. So as part of this security model, the macOS kernel has SIP-related functionality built in to prevent processes from writing to certain protected parts of the file system. Now, this protection is in addition to that read-only boot volume. SIP's configuration is stored in NVRAM, so the current configuration will apply even when boot drives are switched and also if the OS is reinstalled. Now, SIP is an overall security policy with the goal of preventing system files and processes from being modified by third parties. Now, to achieve this, it has the following concepts: file system protection, runtime protection, and kernel extension protection. Now, Apple has set a number of directories used by macOS as being protected by SIP. Now, with some exceptions, which we'll be talking about more in a bit, all files and folders contained within these directories cannot be moved, edited, or changed by root or any other user on the system. Apple has also set a number of directories used by macOS as being available to developers. So in one of the exceptions I was just talking about, /user is protected by SIP, but /user local is not. That means developers are explicitly permitted to place files and folders inside of user local without worrying that Apple's going to lock down that directory. Now, SIP's protections are not limited to protecting the system from file system changes. There are also system calls that are restricted in their functionality. For example, dtrace can inspect system processes, either using the instruments application or the dtrace command line tool. However, SIP does not block inspection by the developer of their own applications while they're being developed. Xcode's tools do continue to allow apps to be inspected and debugged during the development process. And for those interested in this, I recommend taking a look at Apple's developer documentation for SIP, which is available via the link in the screen. Now, SIP also blocks installation of unsigned kernel extensions. Now, of course, kernel extensions are going away, but this is something that SIP also provides protection for. In order to install a kernel extension with SIP enabled, a kernel extension must be signed with the developer ID for signing KEX certificates and must be installed into library extensions. And it also must be compiled for the operating system on which it's intended to run. For example, if you need a kernel extension to run on Apple Silicon, it needs to be a kernel extension that's compiled to run for Apple Silicon. More information on this is also available in Apple's developer documentation for SIP. And for those interested, the kernel extension documentation is available via the link shown on the screen. Now, SIP has a configuration file, which is stored in System Library Sandbox and is named rootless.conf. It lists all the applications and the top level directories which SIP is protecting. So this protection applies to the writable part of the Mac's disk. So in addition to the read-only boot volume, this is marking even more of the Mac's file system off limits to being altered by the root user. Now, Apple has defined some exceptions to SIP's protection in the rootless.conf file, and those exceptions are marked in the rootless file with asterisks. So these mark writable files and directories which are stored in otherwise protected locations. Apple has also put in place protections for user data, where permission to access the data must be granted by either the user in question or by a profile delivered by a mobile device management server which the Mac is enrolled with. And these permissions are also not granted to a user account, but instead are granted to the processes actually requesting access to the user data in question. So after examining all the protections that Apple has put in place to contain the power of the root account, where large sections of the file system can't be written to or altered, and user data requires permission to access, let's re-examine that statement about root as it relates to administrator rights. Now, it remains true that anything root can do, an account with admin rights can do, but what root can do on macOS is significantly contained compared to other Unix-based OSs. And with that lowered capability comes lowered risk. So now that we've examined how admin rights work and their capabilities, let's look at managing them. So as discussed earlier, Apple has enabled an account to have admin rights in 2 locations. The first is places by adding the user account in question to the admin group. Adding to the admin group gives the account the ability to authenticate for admin rights in the macOS graphical user interface. However, this does not apply to the command line interface. For the command line interface, as discussed earlier, Apple will install a configuration file for sudo, which grants members of the admin group all the privileges that the sudo tool can grant. So what's this mean? Well, among other things, it means that admin rights for the GUI and the command line can actually be managed separately. If desired, you could assign admin rights in the GUI, but not to the command line, or vice versa, by editing the sudo configuration file to change it from Apple's default settings. Now, properly editing the sudo configuration is an advanced topic we are not going to be covering in today's talk, but this is an aspect of admin rights management to be aware of. So, assuming that you do choose to manage admin rights and you're choosing to keep it the same between the graphical user interface and the command line interface, there are 3 states of management to consider for your accounts. There's admin rights all the time, there's no admin rights ever, and allowing admin rights at least some of the time. So there are pros and cons to each idea, so let's consider each in turn. So the first is granting admin rights to your users without time limits or other restrictions. So this is relatively straightforward, as by default, all you should need to do is add the account in question to the admin group. Now, the pro is that the account can perform all actions that any admin user on the Mac can perform. The main con is also going to be the same. That account can perform all actions that any admin user on the Mac can perform. Second is granting no admin rights to your users. Again, this is relatively straightforward, as by default, you shouldn't need to do anything besides create the account and then not specify admin rights for it. Now, the pro is that standard accounts are limited in the actions that they can take. Now, this is also the con because every necessary action a user may need to take, they may not have the ability to perform it. For you as the IT admin, this may mean that you'll need to come up with a mechanism which enables users with only standard user rights the ability to perform an action which only root or an administrator can perform. The last state is the in-between, where admin rights are granted at least some of the time to an account, and those same rights are taken away at least some of the time. So is there one answer, one best way? Unfortunately, there is not. What works for one shop may not work for another. There are a number of factors that affect this discussion, which may include legal requirements, complying with the standards of an external standard that your business has committed to complying with, internally created policy requirements of your company, school, or institution, or even operational requirements for your environment. No matter what, though, the key question which must be answered is if you can trust your users with admin rights. If you can, in my opinion, then they should have them. If you can't, then they shouldn't. Now, since different situations are going to have different answers, what's the answer for my environment? Well, my own shop is using the in-between model of non-permanent admin rights. To manage and enforce this, we're using a tool named Privileges, which we built and open sourced. And for those interested, it is available via the link on the screen. So where did this tool come from and why did SAP start using it? Well, in 2009, both my current boss, Harold Monahart, and my teammate, Mark Thielman, worked for a German publishing house. And this publishing house decided to switch some of their departments from using Windows PCs to now using Macs. Now, the goal behind the switch was to move users towards a self-service model, where the users could handle more support issues themselves without needing the help desk. Now, the admin rights management aspect of the plan was that all the Mac users would have admin rights to help facilitate the users being able to help themselves more. However, not all the folks moving to Macs were comfortable with having those admin rights. They were afraid they would break something if they had admin rights. So as part of that, two tools were created using AppleScript Studio. The first enabled logged in users to add themselves to the admin group, and the second would remove the logged in user from the admin group. Now, over time, this tool was refined, where it moved from two tools written in AppleScript Studio to one tool written in Objective-C, which handled both removing and adding the logged in user from the admin group. Now, in 2016, both Harold and Mark were hired by SAP. So at the time, admin rights at SAP were being handled such that the first account on the Mac was a generic admin user for use by the local IT support. SAP was also using AD mobile accounts on Macs at the time, and the mobile account of the Mac's assigned user was also added to the admin group. So this was done by having a script on the Mac check with a separate system to see if the mobile account in question belonged to the machine's owner as defined in this separate system. The problem was that the script had a high failure rate. So many times the help desk would have to intervene and then manually do this admin rights assignment. Now, at the same time, SAP's IT security ran penetration testing on their managed endpoints as part of their work to secure the SAP computing environment. And one of the recommendations that came out of the testing was, while the business need for admin rights was recognized, people should not work with permanently assigned admin rights. So at this point, the decision was made to write our privileges tool. Harold and Mark knew that a self-service model worked, as at one point they had 6,000 users using their previous tools for adding and removing admin rights. And privileges solved three issues at once. First, it removed the need to centrally assign an owner to a device. Second, it allowed people to get admin rights on demand. And third, privileges includes a command line tool, which I'll be discussing in more detail later. Now, this command line tool provides a mechanism to remove admin rights for users without the user's involvement. And between those 3 points, we achieved the rare accomplishment of making both security and our users happy. So beginning with macOS Sierra in 2016, SAP has included privileges as part of its standard setup for all SAP managed Macs. Our answer is to use standard users by default and ensure that the privileges app is installed. Now that means that our users run as standard users the vast majority of the time. But when they need admin rights, those rights are available on demand. So here's how privileges looks from the user perspective. If you're a standard user and you want admin rights, you verify the privileges that is installed, and then you use the following procedure. You launch privileges, you click the request privileges button. The privileges dock icon should change to look like a yellow unlock padlock, and a message should appear that privileges have been changed successfully. And the logged in user should now have admin rights. Now, if you're an admin user and you want to remove admin rights, verify that privileges is installed, and then you use the following procedure. Launch privileges, click the remove privileges button. The privileges dock icon should change to look like a green locked padlock, and a message should appear that privileges have been changed successfully. And that logged in account should now have standard user rights. Privileges also includes the concept of time-limited admin, which is available exclusively in privileges via the toggle privileges function. The default amount of time is 20 minutes, though you can change this in the privileges settings. So for more information about this, please see the privileges FAQ, which is linked in the bottom of the screen. Privileges also includes a command line tool, as mentioned previously, which allows you to use privileges from a script or from the command line. The PrivilegesCLI command line tool currently includes the following options. There's PrivilegesCLI add, which adds the logged in user to the admin group. There's PrivilegesCLI remove, which removes the logged in user from the admin group. And there's PrivilegesCLI status, which shows what privileges the logged in user has. The PrivilegesCLI command line tool can also be run without any modifiers, which displays the help information. Now, SAP uses the privileges command line tool for managing privileges by installing a launch agent which runs the tool's remove option to remove admin rights on login. Now, this removes the user logging in from the admin group, which automatically puts the user back to standard user rights. Now, for those wanting to implement a similar solution, a sample launch agent is available via the link at the bottom of the screen. Now, as mentioned previously, we open source privileges, and in fact, we just uploaded version 1.5.3 yesterday. And it's been very interesting and gratifying to our team to see that a number of other folks have been interested in it. We've even seen folks build solutions for their own needs based on privileges. We've also seen vendors use privileges to build extended functionality for their own products. Now, is privileges the right tool for your environment to help you manage admin rights? Well, going back to our earlier discussion about trust, you really do need to answer that fundamental question. If you can trust your users with admin rights, then privileges may be a good tool for helping you manage those rights. If you can't, there's nothing privileges can do to help you with that. It is crucial to settle this fundamental issue before proceeding. That said, many times I've heard the discussion coming down to this. However, the understanding of what anything means comes from this era, when it should be coming from this era, when a number of limitations have been placed on what the root account and admin accounts can do. This is the logical place to start from when trying to answer the questions, the fundamental question about trusting your users with admin rights. Now, I know I tossed up a lot of links in this presentation, but this is possibly the most important set of links you see during this entire presentation, because this is how you get it all. PDF is available from the link at the middle of the screen, and keynote slides, which includes the demos, the movies, the everything, the presenter's notes, is available by the link at the bottom of the screen. So I'm going to leave that up and running and open the floor for questions.
All right, well, thank you very much for that presentation, Rich. We're going to go ahead and get started with QA. First one's just more of a comment than a question, but it's from Sequoia saying, absolutely loving the history lesson. So I believe your history lesson on macOS was very much enjoyed. Our first question comes from Anonymous that says, what sorts of safeguards are in place for Macs where the admin has figured out how to disable SIP?
Well, I would say for that, the only place you can disable SIP is from the recovery environment. So restrict access to your recovery environment. You can do that via a firmware password. I think on Apple Silicon that's now referred to as a recovery password. But if you want to restrict people from being able to turn off zip, that's the best way that I can do it, is restricting access to recovery.
All right, the second question here from Tony says, will privileges work if Jamf Connect with Azure AD is active? Azure currently sets the user to standard or administrator depending on the role set in Azure.
You know, I haven't tested that scenario, so I'm not sure how exactly that will work. What privileges does is it will add and remove the account of the logged in user to the local admin group. So if just adding someone to the local admin group in that scenario will work, then privileges should work.
Our next question comes from Tony. Is there any type of answer you'd give to InfoSec teams who'd question why use a tool to give on-demand admin rights, and what's to stop a user from just constantly elevating themselves to achieve permanent admin access?
Well, there is, in our case, a number of management options available with privileges. You can restrict, for example, the ability to use privileges to a certain group or to even a specific user. So, for example, if you have a local IT account and you want to make sure that only they can use privileges, then you put down a profile that says only this user can do this. You know, we do have a number of management options, and we also have the ability to, when someone wants to elevate privileges, they have to supply a reason. In fact, one of the new features in Privileges 153, which we released yesterday, is that you can supply a canned list of reasons, and you can say how long basically how many characters they need to type before that reason is accepted. Because of course you can still also just put in a text entry reason, like you know, when I was testing, I was like saying things like by the power of Grayskull, which I feel is a perfectly valid reason to get admin rights in my environment. But yeah, so there's a number of management options with privileges where you can restrict it, or you can just, you know, say you need to authenticate as the logged in user to do it, which will accept a standard user's password in order to do it. Or there's just, you know, tell us why. And in which case that reason is logged, and the InfoSec group can review that later if they have something set up for getting logs from the endpoint up to like a central monitoring system.
Awesome. We have another question here. Adding a user to the admin group grants a large set of permissions. However, authorization database has more granular control, like system.install.software. What are the pros and cons of using authorization instead?
I'd say the pro is that you can get more granular. The con is you really have to understand what you are setting. And frankly, that is an advanced topic all on its own. So I know of folks who do a lot of, you know, management of the authorization database, but you really do have to understand what you're doing, and you really do have to understand what permissions you're applying to try to do, you know, that kind of granular management.
All right. So our next is a comment from Bruce Carter saying, those old desktops brought a tear to my eye, Rich, with a smiley face.
Yeah.
Share that. And our next question from Anonymous is it possible to change the time interval via a profile, or I will say an MDM?
So yes, we do have the option if one of the management options we have for privileges is the ability to, for the toggle privileges function, manage that amount of time. I want to be very specific that time limit admin in privileges is limited to the toggle privileges function, because I will often get folks who apply the profile that does time limited admin, and then they'll be like, well, it's not working. And when I quiz them on this, they're not using toggle privileges. They're just launching the app and they're expecting it to work. Unfortunately, that is not the way privileges works. The only way you get time limited admin is via the toggle privileges function. Now, that said, we do have those profile options for managing that time with the toggle privileges function.
Okay, great. Is there a way to keep logs of privileges related activities for audit purposes?
Absolutely. That all gets logged into the unified system logging. And if you look at the frequently asked questions up on the privileges GitHub site, it describes how what strings and predicates you should be using to pull information like that.
Okay. Is there a concern that a user can uninstall a management agent like Jamf?
I guess that's going to depend on different shops. If you have admin rights, you can, specifically, if you have the ability to run sudo with root privileges, then yes, you can. And is that a concern for your shop? Well, you have to decide that.
Yep, for sure. When you provision your computers, are you using Setup Assistant to allow them to be added as admins and then demoting them, or are they standard and then being upgraded?
We are trying to follow Apple's stuff as closely as possible. So when it first creates the account, it is an admin account, and then we put in place that launch agent. And one of the things that we actually have is that you have to log out and log in to enable File Vault. So during that login, that log out, login process, now they're back to being a standard user again. So as part of our setup process, they get dropped back into being a standard user, but only after the setup is done.
Great. Another question from Scott. Often the prompt windows needing admin rights to do something does not include the file name to tell us what file is needing admin rights. How do we get what app is needing elevation to work? We can't rely on, quote, the last thing they clicked.
I don't know.
I'm not sure about that one either.
Yeah, that seems more like an issue that is not necessarily admin rights as it is something else, and I'm not sure what that is.
That's a great question for the Slack instance, I would say.
Yes.
All right. How about when weighing giving admin rights? Where did the common saying that the largest worry is users making mistakes factor into your decision making?
I guess that really factors into what you mean by users making mistakes, because there's a lot you can do to make mistakes that don't require admin privileges at all, that only require standard user rights. For example, phishing, that doesn't require admin rights at all. If you really want to mess up your user account, you can do it without a single admin right. So that users making mistakes, I don't really think that's part of the admin rights discussion, except for the part where you're like, do you trust your users? Because people are going to make mistakes. So I'm not quite sure where that would factor in. Like if you're like, my users are going to make mistakes and I don't trust them with admin rights because of it, well, then you don't.
True. Is it possible to export the actions of a user who has admin rights while using privileges to a syslog server?
As a matter of fact, that's absolutely possible. So we have a profile. If you look up on the GitHub repo and the wiki, we have a management section. We have a profile that will actually let you export privileges, log actions to a syslog server.
Awesome. If everything is signed and notarized and essentially being protected, the only issue with having admin rights is installing apps that have system network extensions. In a managed environment, that is moot issue. So long as the checkbox isn't checked in Jamf, for instance, that allows users to approve set extensions. That's more of like an opinion from Anonymous.
Yeah, I'm not really seeing the question there.
Yeah, me neither. But our next question is, how is this different than a security hole that allows a privilege escalation? What prevents this from being used nefariously?
That's a good question. So what does this is we have an XPC helper that actually handles the elevation. And we have a number of controls in place to make sure that what it is being told to do is coming from the privileges app specifically, that it is looking for something that is, properly signed, properly identified. If you're asking for what prevents someone, who is the logged in user from elevating and demoting themselves, nothing, because they're the logged in user. You can't promote another account other than the logged in user to being an admin. So it's not like you can silently in the background elevate this one user account that, malware might have installed. That doesn't work that way. It only works for the logged in user.
We have another question. Is our company the only one that needs users to share access to the same live user session? It basically forces us to share passwords. I'm going to say probably yes.
I unfortunately, I'm going to say probably no. I'm glad my company's not the old one, but is not one that does this. But I'm sure there's a non-zero number of companies that is more than one that does this. I don't know what to do to fix that. That's a management issue, but it's not a necessarily computer management issue so much it is a people management issue.
It's an interesting one.
Do you commonly scope this to all or just special use cases?
So at SAP, every managed Mac has privileges installed. It's part of our compliance setup. You must have privileges installed.
All right.
All right.
Well,
We want to give. Go ahead, Rusty.
Thanks, Josh. Well, thank you, Rich, for taking the time to present today's session.
Sure thing.